I still remember the day my best friend Ollie looked me straight in the eyes and said something that froze my heart. We were sitting at our usual tea stall after work. I was exhausted like always. My shoulders hurt, my head felt heavy, and all I wanted was silence before going home. Ollie kept staring at me strangely. I laughed and said, "Why are you looking at me like that?" He didn't smile. Instead, he leaned closer and said quietly, "Armin, when you leave for office, your house is not as quiet as you think." At first I laughed. I shook my head and replied, "What kind of line is that?" But Ollie stayed serious. I stopped smiling slowly. I asked, "What are you talking about?" He looked around carefully before speaking again. "People in the neighborhood are talking." My chest tightened instantly. I forced myself to stay calm and asked, "Talking about what?" Ollie hesitated for a moment. Then he finally said, "Your wife Sarah has been seen with a man when you are not home." For a second I thought I heard him wrong. I stared at him and laughed again, but this time the sound felt weak. I said, "That's impossible. Sarah loves me." Even while saying those words, my hands started shaking under the table. Ollie noticed immediately. He sighed and said, "I knew you would react like this." I asked sharply, "Who said this?" He replied, "Different people." I shook my head. "No. Someone is lying." Ollie looked directly into my eyes. "I hope they are." Silence fell between us. I suddenly felt cold even though the evening air was warm. I whispered, "You really believe this?" Ollie answered carefully, "I believe something is wrong." I rubbed my forehead and said, "Sarah would never do that to me." Ollie stayed quiet for a second before replying, "Sometimes we only see what we want to see." That sentence hit harder than I expected. I stood up suddenly and said, "I should go home." Ollie grabbed my arm lightly. "Don't confront her emotionally." I looked at him with anger and confusion mixed together. How am I supposed to react to this? He answered softly, carefully. The ride home felt longer than usual. My mind kept repeating Ollie's words over and over again. "Your house is not as quiet as you think." I kept telling myself he was wrong. Sarah loved me. She always waited for me. She always smiled when I came home. She always asked if I had eaten. None of this made sense. When I reached home, Sarah opened the door with her usual smile. "You're late today," she said softly. I looked at her face carefully. For the first time, something felt different. Or maybe I was different now. I forced a small smile and replied, "Work was busy." She touched my arm gently. "Sit down." I made dinner. I nodded quietly. During dinner she kept talking normally. "How was work? Did Hassan bother you again? You look tired." I answered every question, but my mind was somewhere else. At one point she laughed about something small and I caught myself staring at her too long. She noticed. "What?" she asked with a smile. I quickly looked away. Nothing. But inside me, everything felt strange. That night I lay beside her in bed staring at the ceiling. Sarah turned toward me and whispered, "You seem quiet tonight." I replied, "Just tired." She placed her hand lightly on my chest and said, "You worked too hard." Normally that touch would comfort me. That night it made my heart ache. After a few minutes she fell asleep peacefully beside me. I stayed awake. My mind replayed every moment from the last few months. The late phone calls. The sudden errands. The times she seemed distracted while talking to me. Things I ignored before suddenly felt important. I hated myself for even thinking like this. I whispered quietly into the darkness, "No. Sarah would never do this." But doubt had already entered my mind. And once doubt enters, peace disappears. The next morning Ollie called me before work. He asked carefully, "How are you?" I replied coldly, "I barely slept." He sighed. "I'm sorry." I asked him, "Did you actually see anything yourself?" He paused before answering. "No. But enough people noticed things for me to warn you." I leaned against the wall and closed my eyes. Then I asked quietly, "Why didn't you tell me earlier?" Ollie answered softly, "Because I hoped it wasn't true." I started watching everything carefully after that conversation with Ollie. Before, I never noticed how much Sarah used her phone. Now it was impossible to ignore. Every few minutes her screen lit up. Every notification pulled her attention away from me. One evening I asked casually, "Who keeps messaging you?" She looked up quickly and smiled. "Just work stuff." Then she turned the phone face down on the table. That small movement stayed in my mind longer than it should have. Later that night her phone rang again. She stood up immediately and walked toward the balcony. I followed slowly with my eyes. Her voice became softer the moment she stepped outside. When she returned I asked, Who was it? She replied too quickly. Office call. I nodded quietly, but my chest felt tight again. The next few days became worse. Sarah started taking more calls outside the room. Sometimes she even smiled at her screen while typing messages. When I entered suddenly, she locked her phone instantly. Before, I would never have noticed these things. Now I noticed everything. One evening Ollie called me. He asked, "How are things?" I laughed bitterly. "I don't know anymore." He stayed silent for a second before saying, "Did you ask her directly?" I replied, "No." He said, "Good." I frowned. "Good?" Ollie answered carefully, "You need proof, not emotions." I leaned against the kitchen counter and closed my eyes. Then I asked quietly, "What if the proof destroys me?" Ollie replied softly, "The truth hurts less than living blind." That sentence stayed inside my head all night. The next evening something happened that made my stomach drop completely. I had just returned from work when Mrs. Khan from next door stopped me near the gate. She looked nervous. I smiled politely and said, "Is everything okay?" She hesitated before speaking. "Can I tell you something?" My heart suddenly started beating faster. I nodded slowly. "Of course." She lowered her voice and said, "Your wife had a guest yesterday when you were not home." For a second I stopped breathing. I stared at her silently. Then I forced myself to ask, "A guest?" She nodded awkwardly. "A man." My hands instantly became cold. I asked quietly, "Are you sure?" Mrs. Khan sighed. "I would not lie about something like this." I tried to smile, but my face felt frozen. "Thank you," I whispered. She touched my arm gently. "I'm sorry." I walked into my house feeling like the floor beneath me was unstable. Sarah greeted me normally again. "You're home early today," she said with a smile. I stared at her for a moment longer than usual. Then I replied quietly, "Yeah." She walked into the kitchen and asked, "Do you want tea?" I watched her carefully. Every movement suddenly felt suspicious. Every smile felt rehearsed. But I said nothing. That night during dinner she kept trying to talk. "How was work? Did Hassan annoy you again? Why are you so quiet?" I answered shortly every time. "Fine." "No. Just tired." She looked uncomfortable. For the first time my silence made her nervous. Later that night she asked softly, "Did I do something wrong?" I looked directly into her eyes for a second. I almost asked her everything. Who was the man? Why was he here? How long had this been happening? But Ali's words stopped me. "You need proof, not emotions." So I simply replied, "No." Sarah kept staring at me strangely. Then she whispered, "You're acting different." I forced a weak smile. "Maybe I'm just stressed." She nodded slowly, but I could see uncertainty in her face now. That night I barely slept again. Every sound in the house kept waking me up. Every vibration from her phone felt like another knife in my chest. The next morning I made a decision. I would start coming home early without telling anyone. Not once. Repeatedly. Quietly. The first day nothing happened. Sarah looked surprised when I entered early, but she smiled normally. The second day she seemed nervous for a moment before relaxing again. The third day she quickly locked her phone when I walked in. I pretended not to notice. Days passed like this. I kept watching, listening, thinking. But I still saw nothing clear enough to confront. That almost made things worse. Because without proof, my mind created endless possibilities. One evening Ali met me again after work. He looked at me carefully and asked, "Did you find anything?" I shook my head slowly. "No." He frowned. "Then maybe people were wrong." I wanted to believe that. I really did. But deep inside something felt broken already. I whispered quietly, "Then why does everything feel like a lie now?" Ali had no answer for that. At home Sarah touched my shoulder gently one night and asked, "Are you okay?" I looked at her hand resting on me. Then I replied softly, "I don't know anymore." She looked confused by my answer. But I couldn't explain what was happening inside me. I was living in my own house like a stranger. Every room felt unfamiliar. Every conversation felt forced. And every day the feeling of being lied to grew stronger inside my chest until something deep within me slowly started breaking apart piece by piece without making any sound at all anymore now. That day I came home early again. My hands were sweating so badly I could barely hold my keys properly. My heart was beating like crazy the entire ride home. I kept telling myself I was overthinking everything. Maybe Ali was wrong. Maybe Mrs. Khan misunderstood. Maybe my mind had turned fear into suspicion. I wanted to believe that more than anything else. When I reached the house, I stood outside the door for a few seconds trying to breathe normally. Then I opened the door quietly. The moment I stepped inside, I heard laughter coming from the living room. A man's voice. I froze instantly. Every sound inside my head disappeared except my heartbeat. For 1 second I could not move. Then slowly, quietly I stepped closer. And I saw them. Sarah was sitting on the couch beside a man I had never seen before. They were not touching. They were not physically inappropriate. But the comfort between them said everything. The way she smiled at him. The way he sat there casually inside my house. The way they looked relaxed together. None of it felt innocent. Sarah looked up first. The moment she saw me, her face lost all color. She stood up quickly. "Armin, you are early." Her voice sounded panicked. The man stood up too. He said nothing. He just looked at me silently. I stared at both of them, feeling something collapse slowly inside my chest. Then I finally asked, "Who is he?" Sarah opened her mouth but no words came out. That hesitation destroyed me more than any answer could have. The man looked uncomfortable and rubbed his hands together nervously. Sarah finally whispered, "Armin, listen." I cut her off immediately. "Who is he?" This time my voice sounded colder. She looked at the man for a second before replying, "He's just a friend." I almost laughed hearing that. "A friend?" I repeated quietly. The man finally spoke. "I should leave." I looked directly at him and asked, "What's your name?" He hesitated before answering. "Ryan." The name burned itself into my mind instantly. I nodded slowly and stepped aside from the doorway. "Then leave, Ryan." Sarah quickly said, "Wait." But he was already walking toward the door. The silence between all three of us felt unbearable. Before leaving, Ryan looked at Sarah one last time. That look told me more than words ever could. Then he walked out. The door closed softly behind him. And silence filled the house completely. Sarah stood there shaking slightly. I stayed still near the entrance staring at her. Finally she whispered, "It's not what you think." I closed my eyes for 1 second. Then I laughed quietly. Not because anything was funny. Because hearing those exact words hurt more than shouting would have. I looked at her again and asked softly, "Then what should I think?" She stepped closer carefully. "Nothing happened." I repeated her words slowly. "Nothing happened." She nodded quickly. "Yes." I asked, "Then why was he here?" Sarah rubbed her hands nervously. "He just came to talk." I stared at her silently. She continued, "You've been distant lately and I interrupted again. "So this is my fault now?" Her eyes filled with tears immediately. "No. That's not what I mean." I walked past her slowly into the living room. 2 cups of tea sat on the table. One of them still had steam rising from it. I looked around the room feeling like I no longer recognized my own house. Sarah followed behind me carefully. "Please say something." I asked quietly, "How long?" She froze. That silence answered enough already. I turned toward her slowly. "How long has he been coming here?" Sarah whispered, "Not long." I shook my head slightly. "Don't lie again." Tears rolled down her face. I never wanted this. Those words broke something inside me completely. Because deep down I realized she was no longer denying it. She was only regretting it. I sat down slowly on the couch feeling exhausted suddenly. Sarah stood there crying quietly. After a few seconds she whispered, "I was lonely." I looked up at her and asked, "While I was working every day for us?" She covered her mouth crying harder. "I didn't mean for this to happen." I stared at the floor for a long moment. Then I asked softly, "Did you love him?" Sarah quickly shook her head. "No." But I no longer knew what to believe. My chest hurt so badly it felt difficult to breathe. Sarah knelt in front of me and reached for my hand. I pulled it away immediately. That hurt expression on her face would have destroyed me before. Now it only made me feel tired. She whispered, "Please don't look at me like this." I asked quietly, "Like what?" "Like I'm a stranger." I looked around the room again before answering. "I think I'm the stranger here." Silence returned once more. Heavy. Cold. Final. Sarah kept crying softly while I sat there staring into nothing. And in that moment I realized something terrifying. After that day, everything inside me started collapsing slowly. I stopped eating properly. Food lost its taste. Sleep stopped feeling peaceful. Even silence became exhausting. Sarah kept trying to talk to me but I barely listened anymore. One night she stood in front of me and whispered, "Please say something." I kept staring at the television without replying. She sat beside me carefully. "Armin, I know you're hurt. I finally looked at her and asked quietly, "Do you?" Tears filled her eyes instantly. She whispered, "I never wanted to destroy us." I laughed bitterly. "You already did." She shook her head quickly. "No. We can still fix this." I looked away again. "There is nothing left to fix." Her breathing became uneven. I was confused. I replied coldly, "That word doesn't help anymore." She touched my arm gently. I felt lonely. I pulled my arm away immediately. "You weren't lonely enough to stop lying." She started crying harder. "I thought you stopped caring about me." I stood up slowly and looked directly at her. "You brought another man into my house because you felt ignored?" Sarah covered her face with both hands. "I made a mistake." I answered quietly, "You made choices." Then I walked away before she could say anything else. That night Ollie came over again. The moment he saw me, he frowned. "You look terrible." I sat down heavily and replied, "I feel worse." Ollie stayed silent for a moment before speaking carefully. "So what now?" I rubbed my eyes tiredly. "I don't know." He leaned back and said, "You have two choices. Break or fight." I didn't answer, because honestly I felt too tired for either. Ollie sighed. "Staying silent forever won't save you." I looked at him and whispered, "Nothing can save this anymore." He stared at me carefully. "Then save yourself." Those words stayed inside my head long after he left. The next morning I went to work feeling completely drained. I could barely focus on anything. During lunch Mina sat across from me and kept staring quietly. Finally she asked, "Are you okay?" I forced a weak smile. "Yeah." She shook her head immediately. "No. You look like you're carrying a dead weight inside you." I laughed bitterly. "Maybe I am." Her expression softened. "Do you want to talk about it?" I looked down at my untouched food and replied quietly, "Not really." Mina nodded slowly. Then she said something unexpected. "Whatever happened, don't let it destroy who you are." I almost laughed again, because I already felt destroyed. The rest of the day passed slowly. Every conversation around me sounded distant. Every small problem at work felt meaningless compared to what waited at home. When I returned that evening, Sarah was sitting alone in the living room. The moment she saw me, she stood up quickly. "Can we please talk?" I sighed tiredly. "What is left to say?" She stepped closer. "I know I hurt you." I stayed silent. She continued softly, "I was confused, lonely, and I felt ignored." I closed my eyes for a second. Those words sounded like excuses now. Nothing more. I whispered quietly, "You keep talking about your pain." Sarah looked hurt immediately. "What about yours?" I looked directly at her. "You never thought about mine while lying to me." She started crying again. "I never stopped loving you." I shook my head slowly. "Love doesn't look like betrayal." She whispered desperately, "Please believe me." I replied calmly, "I don't know how anymore." Silence filled the room again. Then she asked softly, "Do you hate me?" I thought about the question carefully. "No." She looked surprised. "Then what do you feel?" I stared at her for a long moment before answering honestly. "Tired." That answer seemed to hurt her more than anger would have. She sat down slowly, crying into her hands. I watched her quietly for a moment. Then I walked into the bedroom and grabbed a blanket. Sarah looked up immediately. "What are you doing?" I replied softly, "I'm sleeping on the couch tonight." Her face fell completely. "Please don't do this." I kept walking toward the living room. She followed behind me. "Armin, please." I placed the blanket on the couch and turned toward her. "For once, stop asking me for something." Tears rolled down her face again. She whispered, "I miss you." I answered quietly, "You should have thought about that earlier." Then I lay down on the couch and turned away from her. For a few seconds she just stood there silently. Then she whispered softly, "Good night." I didn't answer. After a while I heard her bedroom door close slowly. I stared into the darkness, feeling emptier than ever before. The house no longer felt warm. It no longer felt safe. Something changed inside me. Pain turned into focus. I stopped crying at night. I stopped staring at the ceiling, waiting for answers that would never come. Ollie looked at me one evening and said, "You look different now." I replied, "Maybe I am." He sat beside me and asked, "What changed?" I said, "Pain gets tired too." He nodded slowly. "Good. Because now you can think clearly." I leaned back and said, "I need to know everything." Ollie replied, "Then stop acting like a victim and start paying attention." That sentence stayed in my mind. The next day he called me during lunch. He said, "I found out the guy's name." My chest tightened slightly. Who is he? Ollie replied, Ryan? I repeated the name quietly. Ryan. Ollie said, does it sound familiar? I said, no. But now it will stay in my head forever. Ollie sighed. I also asked around. Mrs. Khan was right. I stayed silent. He continued, Ryan came to your house more than once. I closed my eyes for a moment and asked, how many times? Ollie replied, enough. That answer told me everything. That evening I met Mrs. Khan outside again. She looked uncomfortable and said, I did not want to interfere in your marriage. I replied calmly, you already helped me more than you know. She hesitated before saying, that man came often when you were away. I nodded slowly. Thank you for telling me the truth. She said softly, I am sorry. I looked toward my house and replied, so am I. But this time I did not feel rage. I felt focus. At home Sarah asked, why are you staring at me like that? I replied, like what? She said, cold? I smiled slightly. Maybe I am just tired. She walked closer and touched my arm. You barely speak to me anymore. I looked at her hand and said, words lose value after lies. She stepped back silently. For the first time, I saw nervousness in her eyes instead of confidence. That night Ollie stayed over again. He said, what is your plan now? I replied, no emotional reactions anymore. He raised an eyebrow. So what then? I said, observation. He laughed quietly. You sound dangerous now. I said, no. I sound awake. The next morning I started noticing everything carefully. Every phone call. Every message notification. Every time Sarah smiled at her screen. I stopped confronting her because confrontation gave warnings. Silence gave information. One evening she said, I'm going to the store. I nodded and replied, okay. She looked surprised. You are not asking questions? I said calmly, should I? She quickly answered, no. I watched her leave through the window. Then I checked the time. 43 minutes. When she returned I asked casually, the store was crowded? She froze for half a second before replying, yeah. I smiled slightly. Makes sense. Inside I was memorizing every detail. At work Hassan noticed the change in me. He said, you are becoming serious, Armin. Good. I looked at him and asked, was I not serious before? He laughed. Before you looked distracted all the time. Now you look focused. I replied quietly, focus changes people. He nodded. Whatever happened, use it. I repeated his words in my head all day. Use it. That evening Sarah sat beside me and said, I miss how you used to talk to me. I replied, people change. She whispered, I don't like this version of you. I looked directly into her eyes and said, you created him. She looked away immediately. Later that night Ollie asked, do you still love her? I stayed silent for a long moment. Then I replied, I don't know what I feel anymore. He said, that means the damage is deep. I said, the damage built something else inside me. Ollie looked serious. Just don't lose yourself completely. I replied, maybe losing myself is necessary. Days passed differently after that. I no longer waited for explanations. I searched for patterns. Sarah didn't know I was watching everything now. Every call. Every step. Every lie. One afternoon I came home quietly and heard her laughing softly in the bedroom while talking on the phone. The moment she saw me, the laughter stopped. She ended the call immediately and asked, why are you home early again? I replied calmly, why does that bother you? She forced a smile. It doesn't. I stepped closer and said softly, you should stop getting nervous around me. Her face changed slightly. I am not nervous. I nodded slowly. Good. Then I walked away without another word. That confused her more than anger ever did. At night she asked, what happened to you? I looked at her quietly before replying, I finally started seeing clearly. She whispered, you scare me sometimes now. I said, you should have thought about that earlier. For the first time since everything began, I no longer felt broken. Broken people beg for answers. I stopped begging. Now I was learning. Now I was watching. Now I was changing into someone even I barely recognized anymore. And deep inside, I knew Sarah would never recognize this version of me at all again after everything that happened between us now completely. I started improving my performance at work because staying busy kept my mind from collapsing again. Hassan looked at me one morning and said, you finished all this already? I replied, I had time. He laughed lightly. No. You had focus. I said nothing, but he was right. Pain had turned into discipline. At lunch, Mina sat beside me and asked, "How are you holding up?" I replied, "Better than before." She looked unconvinced. "Better or colder?" I smirked slightly. "Maybe both." She watched me quietly before saying, "You are stronger than you think." I looked down at my coffee and replied, "Strength feels different than I imagined." She asked softly, "What does it feel like?" I answered, "Empty." She did not know how to respond to that. Later that day, Ollie called me. He asked, "Did you check the messages?" I replied, "Yes." He said, "Anything new?" I leaned back in my chair and said, "Enough to confirm everything." Ollie stayed silent for a second before asking, "How bad?" I replied calmly, "Bad enough." At night, I sat alone and went through every detail carefully. Messages, timings, missed calls, excuses, patterns. I stopped seeing emotions in them. Now I saw evidence. Mrs. Khan even agreed to speak honestly if needed. She told me, "I saw that man come several times when you were away." I nodded and replied, "Thank you." She sighed sadly. "I wish things were different." I said quietly, "So do I." But my voice carried no pain anymore. That part of me was fading. One evening, Ollie came over with new information. He sat down and said, "Ryan is married too." I looked at him carefully. "Are you sure?" Ollie nodded. "Completely sure." I stayed silent for a moment. Then I asked, "Does his wife know?" Ollie replied, "I don't think so." I leaned back slowly and whispered, "Interesting." Ollie looked at me closely. "Don't do anything reckless." I said calmly, "I stopped being reckless a long time ago." He replied, "Good. Because truth always comes out. You just have to wait." I repeated those words in my head after he left. Truth always comes out. At home, Sarah started noticing the distance more clearly. She asked me one night, "Why are you so cold now?" I looked at her quietly before replying, "You wouldn't understand." Her eyes filled with tears instantly. She whispered, "I miss you." I replied, "You miss comfort." She shook her head. "That's not fair." I said calmly, "Neither was any of this." She stepped closer. "I am trying to fix things." I asked, "How?" She opened her mouth but no words came out. That silence answered everything again. Later she cried in the bedroom while I sat in the living room. Before, her tears would have destroyed me. Now I felt nothing. That scared me more than anger ever did. The next morning, Mina noticed I was working nonstop again. She asked, "Do you ever rest anymore?" I replied, "Rest makes me think too much." She smiled sadly. "You are running from something." I said, "No. I am walking away from it." She looked at me carefully. "There is a difference?" I answered, "A big one." Days passed and I kept gathering proof quietly. I memorized schedules. I recorded timings. I stopped reacting emotionally because emotions made mistakes. Logic did not. One evening, Sarah said, "You watch me differently now." I replied, "Maybe I finally see clearly." She looked hurt. "Do you hate me?" I thought about it for a second before answering. "No." She looked surprised. "Then what do you feel?" I replied honestly, "Nothing." That answer broke her more than shouting ever could. She sat down slowly and whispered, "I never wanted to lose you." I said quietly, "You lost me the moment lying became easy for you." She started crying again. I walked away calmly. Ollie called later and asked, "How are you handling all this?" I replied, "Better than before." He laughed softly. "You sound dangerous now." I said, "No. Just finished." He became serious. "Don't let this turn you into someone cruel." I stared out the window and replied, "Cruel people don't warn others before breaking them." Ollie sighed. "You still sound hurt." I answered, "Maybe hurt never leaves completely." At work, Hassan clapped my shoulder and said, "Promotion discussions are happening next month." I looked surprised. "Really?" He grinned. "You earned it." For the first time in weeks, I felt something close to satisfaction. Not happiness. Just movement. Progress. That night, Sarah tried talking again. She asked softly, "Can we start over?" I looked directly into her eyes and said, "Some things don't restart." She whispered, "Please don't give up on me." I replied calmly, "My heart already moved on from you." She broke down crying again. And for the first time since everything began, I realized I truly felt nothing watching her tears fall in front of me anymore, because the man who once loved her completely was already gone forever inside me now. Everything exploded faster than I expected. One afternoon loud banging shook my front door. Sarah looked terrified. "Who is that?" I stood up slowly and said, "Open it." She whispered, "You do it." I walked to the door and opened it calmly. A woman stormed inside immediately. She pointed at Sarah and screamed, "You ruined my marriage." Sarah froze completely. "Who are you?" The woman shouted, "Don't act innocent with me." I immediately understood. Ryan's wife. Sarah stepped back and whispered, "Please calm down." The woman laughed angrily. "Calm down? My husband has been sneaking around with you." Sarah shook her head. "It's not like that." I almost laughed hearing those words again. The woman turned toward me and said, "Did you know about this?" I replied quietly, "Yes." She looked shocked for a moment before asking, "And you stayed silent?" I answered, "Silence tells the truth better sometimes." Sarah started crying instantly. "Please stop shouting." The woman pointed at her again. "You were messaging my husband while I was at home waiting for him." Sarah whispered, "I never wanted this." The woman yelled, "Then why did you continue?" Sarah had no answer. Neighbors slowly gathered outside the house after hearing the noise. I could hear whispers through the open door. Everything private was becoming public now. Sarah looked at me desperately and said, "Please say something." I replied calmly, "What exactly should I say?" Her voice cracked. "Help me." Before I could answer, the woman shouted again, "Your husband should leave you." Sarah broke down harder. "Please?" At that moment another voice came from outside. "Enough." Everyone turned toward the door. Inspector Farouk stepped inside with a serious expression. He looked around and asked, "What is happening here?" The woman immediately said, "This woman destroyed my marriage." Inspector Farouk raised a hand. "Lower your voice first." Sarah sat down crying uncontrollably. Inspector Farouk looked at me and asked, "Are you the husband?" I nodded. "Yes." He asked calmly, "Do you want to file any complaint?" I replied, "No." Sarah looked at me with surprise. The inspector frowned slightly. "Then what do you want?" I answered quietly, "Peace." The room went silent for a moment. Ryan's wife suddenly pulled out her phone and shouted, "I have messages." Sarah whispered, "Please don't." But it was too late. Everything was collapsing openly now. Inspector Farouk looked frustrated and said, "All of you sit down before this becomes bigger." The woman sat while still crying angrily. Sarah kept shaking beside the couch. I stayed standing. Inspector Farouk looked at me again. "You seem strangely calm." I replied, "I finished breaking a long time ago." He stared at me for a second but said nothing. After nearly an hour, Ryan's wife finally left. Before leaving she pointed at Sarah and said, "You destroyed 2 homes." Sarah covered her face and cried harder. Door closed. Silence returned again, but now it felt poisonous. Inspector Farouk sighed deeply and said, "These situations never stay hidden forever." I replied quietly, "I know." He looked at Sarah and said, "You need to settle this privately before it spreads further." Sarah nodded weakly. Then he left too. The moment the door closed, Sarah suddenly screamed, "I made a mistake." I looked at her silently. She cried loudly, "I know I ruined everything." I replied calmly, "Yes." She stared at me with disbelief. "That's all you have to say?" I said, "You stopped listening to my pain a long time ago." She fell to her knees crying. "I never thought it would go this far." I answered quietly, "That's the problem with selfish decisions." She looked up at me with red eyes. "Do you hate me now?" I thought about it carefully before replying. "No." She whispered, "Then why are you acting like this?" I said, "Because I don't recognize you anymore." That sentence broke her again. Over the next few days everything became worse. Ryan stopped coming completely. Sarah kept checking her phone constantly. One evening she whispered, "He isn't answering anymore." I replied coldly, "Interesting." She looked hurt by my tone. I continued quietly, "People disappear when consequences arrive." She shouted angrily, "Stop talking like that." I looked directly into her eyes and replied, "Like what? Honest?" She turned away crying again. Ollie came over later that night. He sat beside me and asked, "How does it feel watching all this happen?" I answered honestly, "Empty." He nodded slowly. "This is karma working slowly." I stared around the house quietly. The walls felt different now. Cold, heavy, unfamiliar. I said softly, "This place used to feel alive." Ollie replied, "And now?" I looked toward the hallway where Sarah sat silently crying alone. Then I answered, Now it feels like a courtroom. Ollie stayed quiet after that because even he knew there was nothing left worth defending inside these walls anymore, and every room now carried the sound of broken trust between us all forever there. Sarah stood in front of me crying harder than ever before. She whispered, "Please don't leave." I looked at her quietly and said nothing. She grabbed my hand and said, "We can still fix this." I slowly pulled my hand away. She cried, "Please, Armin. Don't end everything like this." I looked directly into her eyes and said, "You didn't lose me in one day. You lost me little by little." Her face broke completely after hearing that. She whispered, "I know I made mistakes." I replied calmly, "Mistakes happen once. Lies happen again and again." She shook her head desperately. I was confused. I answered, "No. You were selfish." She cried harder. "Please don't say that." I said quietly, "Truth stopped sounding nice a long time ago." She sat down slowly and covered her face. "I never wanted this ending." I replied, "Neither did I." Silence filled the house again. But this silence felt final. Sarah looked up at me with red swollen eyes and whispered, "Do you still love me?" I stayed quiet for a few seconds before answering honestly. "I loved you enough to break myself trying to trust you." Tears rolled down her face again. She asked softly, "And now?" I looked around the house slowly before replying. "Now there's nothing left." She stood up quickly and said, "Please give me one more chance." I shook my head. She stepped closer again. "I can change." I answered quietly, "People change before destruction, not after it." Her breathing became uneven. "I don't want to lose you." I picked up my bag and replied, "You already did." The moment I walked toward the door, she panicked. She cried loudly, "Please don't walk away from me." I stopped for 1 second but never turned around. Then I said softly, "I already walked away inside long ago." And I opened the door. Cool night air hit my face the moment I stepped outside. For the first time in months I felt calm. Not happy. Not excited. Just calm. Mina stood quietly near the gate beside her car. I looked surprised. "What are you doing here?" She gave me a small smile. "Ollie called me." "He sighed softly." She looked at my bag and then at me. "You finally did it?" I nodded slowly. "Yes." She stayed silent for a moment before saying, "How do you feel?" I thought carefully before answering. "Empty. But lighter." Mina stepped beside me quietly. She didn't ask unnecessary questions. She didn't try to comfort me with fake words. She simply looked at me and said, "You're free now." That sentence stayed inside my mind longer than anything else. Free. I looked back once at the house. Sarah stood near the window crying while watching me leave. Months ago that image would have destroyed me. Now it only felt distant. I turned away completely. Months passed after that night. I focused on work. I stopped asking about Sarah. I stopped checking old messages. I stopped reliving memories. One evening Ollie met me for tea and said, "Did you hear what happened?" I already knew what he meant. I asked quietly, "About Sarah?" He nodded. "Her life completely fell apart." I stayed silent. Ollie continued, "Ryan disappeared too." I looked down at my cup calmly. Ollie asked, "Do you feel satisfied?" I thought about it honestly before replying. "No." He looked surprised. "Really?" I nodded slowly. Revenge would have meant anger. I don't feel anger anymore. Ollie stayed quiet. Then I added softly, "I let truth do its job." He smiled slightly after hearing that. Later that night I walked alone through the quiet streets thinking about everything that happened. The betrayal. The lies. The pain. The silence. All of it felt far away now. Not erased. Just finished. I realized something important during those lonely walks. The old version of me died slowly inside that house. The man who ignored signs. The man who begged for honesty. The man who broke himself trying to save someone else. He was gone now. And strangely, I no longer wanted him back. Mina once asked me later, "Do you regret loving her?" I answered honestly, "No." She looked confused. "Why not?" I smiled faintly and replied, "Because pain taught me who I really was." She stayed silent after that. I looked ahead calmly and realized something else too. I survived everything I thought would destroy me. And for the first time in a very long time, I finally felt ready to live again without carrying the weight of someone else's betrayal inside my heart anymore, because that chapter of my life was finally over forever now.